Most people believe the sharpest mind wins every conversation, but the wisest minds know which conversations are not worth entering at all. The most dangerous battles you will ever fight are the ones you chose to enter when walking away was always the better option. There is a question that rarely gets asked directly, even though it sits at the center of so many exhausting interactions. What is this conversation actually for? Not what it appears to be about on the surface, not the topic that was announced, not the issue that was raised. What is it actually doing? What function is it serving for the person pressing hardest to continue it? Because once you can answer that question honestly, the path forward becomes significantly clearer. You stop responding to the surface and start responding, or choosing not to respond, to what is actually operating underneath it. Most people never develop that ability. They remain captivated by the surface, which is exactly where the most practiced provocateurs want them to remain. The surface contains the argument. Underneath, it is the real architecture of the interaction, and understanding that architecture changes everything about how you navigate it. There is a type of person who spends their life collecting arguments the way others collect debts, always adding, never settling, never free. They walk into rooms already calculating how to dismantle whatever anyone else says. They sharpen every word into a weapon, and they mistake that sharpening for intelligence. But there is something quietly broken about a mind that can only feel powerful when it is defeating someone else. Real mental strength does not announce itself through argument. It reveals itself through restraint. The ancient Stoics noticed this long before modern psychology had language for it. They watched the most brilliant people in Rome destroy their own peace, trying to win battles that did not need to be fought. They watched leaders, philosophers, and generals exhaust themselves pursuing approval from people whose judgment was never trustworthy in the first place. And what the Stoics concluded was not that argument is always wrong. It is that most people waste their finest mental energy on audiences who were never equipped to receive it. The problem is not that they argue. The problem is that they argue with people who were never genuinely listening, never genuinely open, and never genuinely willing to consider that they might be wrong. And once a conversation reaches that point, it is no longer an exchange of ideas. It is a performance staged for an audience of one, and that audience is the other person's unexamined ego. Think about the last time you tried to explain yourself to someone who had already decided what they believed about you. You chose your words with unusual care. You softened your tone. You offered evidence. You approached the exchange like a reasonable adult preparing to speak with another reasonable adult. And for a moment, just a moment, something about their expression suggested it might actually work. Then the shift happened, the conversation turned, the topic no longer mattered. Something older, something more emotional, had taken over the exchange entirely. They were no longer responding to your words. They were responding to whatever story they had already written about you inside their own head. And no amount of clarity on your part was going to rewrite that story for them, because some people do not update their beliefs based on evidence. They update their performance based on audience. You were never going to reach them. You were simply providing the resistance they needed to feel justified in whatever conclusion they had already drawn before the conversation even began. This is the first thing the Stoic tradition asks you to understand. Not all minds are in search of truth. Some minds are in search of confirmation. Some are searching for dominance. Some are searching for the emotional reward that comes from watching someone else become frustrated or destabilized. And once you understand what a particular mind is actually searching for, you can stop offering it something it was never seeking in the first place. You can stop bringing clarity to a space that has no interest in receiving it. You can stop being the attempted solution to a problem the other person has no intention of solving. Marcus Aurelius returned to this observation repeatedly across his private journals. He was emperor of the largest civilization on earth, surrounded daily by flatterers, manipulators, and men who confused volume with wisdom. His private notes were not instructions for managing them. They were instructions for managing himself. Do not become what surrounds you, he reminded himself again and again, not because the world would change if he held that standard, but because he understood that a person who absorbs the emotional chaos around them eventually loses something that cannot easily be recovered: the ability to think without noise, to feel without interference, to make decisions rooted in clarity rather than reaction. He had access to all the power in the Roman world, and the discipline he practiced most rigorously was the power to protect his own attention from what tried to consume it. And that is what unnecessary conflict quietly steals. Not your time, though it takes that too. What it really takes is your signal tone, noise ratio. Every argument you replay in your mind at midnight is mental bandwidth that could have been directed towards something that actually builds your life. Every imagined rebuttal you construct while pretending to work is creative energy that could have been used for something real and generative. The ancient Stoics would call this a form of voluntary enslavement. You have handed the keys to your attention to someone who has not earned the right to hold them. And the strangest part is that while you are replaying the exchange in your mind, editing your words, rehearsing a sharper response, the other person has already moved on completely. They are not losing sleep over what you said. They have already found a new argument, a new opponent, a new performance. The conflict continues to live only inside you. That is the hidden wound of foolish engagement. It does not end when the conversation ends. It continues slowly and quietly in the spaces where your peace used to live. Epictetus spent much of his teaching life addressing this exact wound. He had lived as a slave and understood better than almost anyone what it meant to have your external circumstances stripped away entirely. And what he taught his students, often through uncomfortable directness, was that suffering almost always begins in the same place. The moment we try to control something that was never ours to control. Another person's understanding does not belong to you. Their emotional readiness does not belong to you. Their capacity for humility, for reflection, for honest self-examination, none of that is under your authority. Yet, enormous quantities of human energy are spent every single day trying to force exactly those qualities into people who have not developed them and may never choose to. People exhaust themselves attempting to manufacture in others what those others have no interest in building within themselves. And the cost of that attempt is always paid by the person doing the attempting, never by the person being attempted upon. You cannot argue someone into emotional maturity. You cannot debate someone into psychological stability. You cannot explain your way into the good graces of a mind committed to hostility. And the sooner that understanding settles deeply into your thinking, the sooner you stop carrying responsibilities that were never yours to carry. The sooner your conversations become selective rather than obligatory. The sooner your peace becomes something you actively guard rather than something you surrender at the first appearance of friction. Here is what actually happens inside a deteriorating conversation, and most people miss it entirely because they are too absorbed in reacting to stop and observe it. At first, the exchange has a reasonable surface. Words are chosen with some care. Both parties appear to be engaging with the actual content of what the other is saying. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifts beneath the surface. One person stops processing information and starts protecting identity. The goal is no longer understanding it is winning, and once that shift occurs, the entire architecture of the conversation changes. Evidence becomes a threat, clarity becomes an insult. Calm, measured reasoning gets reinterpreted through the lens of the other person's ego rather than through the lens of what you actually intended. Most people respond to this shift by trying harder. They explain one more time, a little more carefully. They add one more piece of evidence, thinking surely this will be the piece that finally lands. They raise their voice slightly, then regret it. They soften their tone, then feel dismissed. What they do not do is stop and ask the single most clarifying question available to them. Has this person actually changed their position based on anything I have said in the last several minutes? Because if the answer is no, if every new point you introduce is immediately reframed as further confirmation of your wrongness, then you are no longer in a conversation. You are in a performance, and the role they need you to play is the increasingly frustrated opponent. The moment you stop playing that role, the performance loses its structural support. This is precisely why silence carries a psychological weight that most people severely underestimate. Silence is not the absence of response. Silence is a response, one that refuses to give the performance what it requires to continue. Silence is not surrender. It is the refusal to participate in a battle you have already won by not entering. People tend to misread silence as weakness because modern culture has constructed a very specific and narrow idea of what strength looks like. Quick, confident, aggressive, loud. The person who fires back fastest gets admired. The person who holds their ground with volume gets respected. The person who simply does not react is assumed to have nothing to say, nothing to offer, no ground worth defending. But that assumption is itself a kind of ignorance, because it takes something far more difficult than matching volume to remain composed when someone is actively working to destabilize you. Anyone can meet chaos with chaos. That requires no real skill. It requires genuine discipline built through sustained practice to meet chaos with stillness. And the person who has built that discipline has access to something the reactive person does not: clarity about what is actually happening and genuine freedom to choose what comes next. Seneca wrote extensively about the specific danger of anger, not anger in the abstract, not as a philosophical category, but anger as a daily hijacker of practical judgment. He watched it operate in the courts of Rome and in his own patterns of thinking, and what he consistently observed was this: anger does not make reasoning sharper. It narrows it. It reduces an entire complex situation down to a single overwhelming impulse to retaliate, to defend, to punish whoever appears to have caused the discomfort being currently experienced. And while that impulse feels like power in the moment, what it actually does is hand authority over your behavior to whoever provoked it. They become the author of your next action. You simply execute their script without realizing you have done so. This is why Seneca placed such extraordinary value on the pause, not a theatrical pause, not a calculated silence designed to appear controlled. A genuine interval between feeling and expression, a moment in which you reclaim authorship of what comes next. That pause is not empty space. Inside it, clarity begins returning. Inside it, you can see the situation for what it actually is, rather than what your agitated nervous system has decided it must be. You can ask, is this response going to serve anything real, or is it simply going to make the next few minutes feel slightly more satisfying while making everything that follows considerably worse? Most people who thrive on emotional conflict understand this intuitively, even when they have never consciously articulated it. They know that the pause is their enemy, so they work constantly to eliminate it. They interrupt before you have finished forming your thought. They escalate before the previous escalation has been fully processed. They change the subject before you have finished thinking about the last one. They repeat the most inflammatory version of their position more loudly when the first version failed to produce the reaction they needed. All of this is strategic, not necessarily consciously planned, but functionally effective. They are working to prevent the pause from occurring, because the pause is where their influence ends and yours begins again. When genuine composure meets an expectation of conflict, something revealing and predictable happens. The person who arrived prepared to fight suddenly has nowhere to direct the energy they brought with them. The architecture of the confrontation begins to lose its integrity, and when that architecture deteriorates, something beneath it becomes visible, something they were not intending to show. Their impatience rises to the surface without permission. The inconsistencies in their position become easier to observe. The fragility underneath the aggression stops being something you must infer and becomes something you can simply see. Because people reveal themselves most honestly, not when they are controlling an exchange, but when the exchange stops proceeding the way they expected. This is what the Stoics meant when they described observation as a form of discipline, not passive, helpless observation, not simply watching while harm is done, but the kind of observation that requires you to remain emotionally disengaged long enough to actually see what is unfolding rather than simply reacting to it. An emotionally reactive mind sees threat, an observing mind sees pattern, and patterns carry information that emotional reaction consistently obscures. The person who constantly redirects conversations toward their own grievances is not defending a principle. They are defending territory, emotional territory they have confused with identity. The person who responds with disproportionate aggression to small corrections is not secure. They are frightened. They fear that if they yield even slightly, something essential about the image they project will begin visibly coming apart. There is something the Stoics observed about emotional environments that modern science has now largely confirmed. Feelings spread between people with a reliability that most individuals have never consciously examined in their own experience. One person's anxiety begins generating anxiety in those around them. One person's aggression begins producing defensiveness in everyone within range. One person's calm, and this is the part that surprises people, begins producing something quieter and more considered in those nearby, often without any of them being able to explain why the atmosphere shifted. Human beings are extraordinarily porous to emotional states belonging to others. We absorb them, reflect them, and amplify them in ways that feel like our own reactions, but are partly something borrowed from the environment. The Stoics treated this permeability not as weakness, but as a reality to be understood and carefully managed. They knew that a person who could not regulate their own emotional state would inevitably be regulated by the states of whoever surrounded them. And a person regulated entirely by their surroundings is not governing themselves. They are being governed by whoever happens to be nearest and loudest. The practice of inner stability was, for them, not primarily about appearing composed for external audiences. It was about genuinely owning the direction of your own experience rather than outsourcing it to circumstances you could not control. Once you begin reading emotional behavior as information rather than as personal attack, an important transformation occurs in how you experience difficult interactions. You stop absorbing them, you start observing them, you stop becoming the thing being acted upon, and become the witness to what is unfolding. This does not mean becoming indifferent to genuine injustice or tolerating real harm behind a mask of philosophical composure. It means developing the capacity to distinguish between situations that genuinely require your emotional participation and situations that only appear to require it because someone has decided they need a reactive audience. Restraint, genuinely practiced, does not diminish you in environments full of emotional noise. It expands you. The person who holds their composure while everyone else around them loses theirs becomes, almost automatically, the most influential presence in the room, not because they demanded that position, but because steadiness commands orientation in a way that volatility never can. People move toward calm the way they move toward warmth. They may resist it consciously, they may even resent it, but some part of them recognizes that this person standing quietly in the noise has access to something they do not currently possess, and that recognition shifts the balance without a single word being spoken. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. They are simply the most frightened of what silence might reveal about them. Over time, as emotional discipline becomes less an effort and more a practiced reflex, something fundamental shifts in how difficult situations register internally. What once felt like a personal assault being misrepresented, dismissed, spoken over, deliberately misunderstood, begins to feel less like something happening to you and more like information about the person in front of you. The grip loosens, the weight decreases. You stop spending the second half of every difficult day relitigating the first half inside your own thinking. Conversations that used to follow you home start staying where they happened. Words that once echoed for days begin fading within hours. Not because you have stopped caring about anything, because you have become more precise about what deserves your care and for how long. This internal shift is subtle enough that many people never notice exactly when it began, but they notice the result. Mornings feel less contaminated by yesterday's frustrations. They move through environments filled with difficult personalities without carrying those personalities into every subsequent environment. The energy that once leaked away defending against things that did not ultimately matter becomes available for things that genuinely do, for building something worth building, for thinking without the constant noise of unresolved grievance, for being genuinely present with people who deserve that quality of attention. This is what it means to reclaim your peace, not to retreat from the world, not to stop caring about outcomes, but to stop opening the door of your interior life to every person who decides they want access to it. Your attention is a limited and genuinely precious resource. The Stoics understood this with unusual clarity, and they believed that how you allocate it, who you grant it to, what you allow it to be captured by, what you consistently refuse to let it be dragged into, is among the most consequential sets of choices any person makes. There is another dimension to foolish behavior, that emotional engagement consistently prevents people from seeing clearly. Not every conflict erupts because someone genuinely cares about the subject being discussed. Some conflicts exist entirely for the emotional reward they provide to the person initiating them. The tension itself is the point. The discomfort they manufacture in you is not a side effect. it is the goal. Your reaction serves as the confirmation they needed, that they matter enough to disturb you, that they can affect the interior state of another person, that they hold some form of influence even when they possess none they have built through anything legitimate. This is what some people experience as power, not genuine authority, not actual influence, but the cheap and temporary satisfaction of knowing that someone else has been made uncomfortable. This is why engaging with such behavior on its own terms almost always intensifies it. You are providing sustenance to something that requires attention in order to survive and grow. Every defensive explanation is received as an invitation to continue pressing. Every visible sign of frustration is processed as evidence that the strategy is effective. And so, the behavior escalates because escalation has been rewarded. The only thing that genuinely interrupts this cycle is removing the reward entirely, not through dramatic withdrawal or visible contempt, but through the simple and extraordinarily difficult act of remaining genuinely and authentically unmoved. Truly grounded people do not require victory in every exchange to feel secure. They do not need opponents humiliated in order to feel their own position is valid. They can receive disagreement without experiencing it as existential threat. They can acknowledge a different perspective without feeling diminished. This is not because they lack conviction. It is because their sense of self is not constructed primarily from other people's agreement. They have built something internal, something quiet and stable, that does not collapse when someone outside them declines to offer approval. Insecure minds cannot operate from that foundation because they have not yet built it. Every challenge to the image they project feels threatening because that projected image is the primary structure holding their sense of worth together. Anything challenging the image challenges the entire construction. So, the response is not honest self-examination, it is the aggressive elimination of whatever appears to be threatening the structure. This is why escalation always feels logical to certain personalities. From the inside, it genuinely registers as self-defense. From the outside, it reads clearly as a person at war with their own unexamined fragility. The Stoics understood that most human aggression originates somewhere in the territory of fear. Not the acute fear of physical danger, the chronic, low-grade fear of being seen as inadequate, unimportant, or fundamentally replaceable. People who relentlessly chase external status are frequently running from the possibility of insignificance. People who require constant control are frequently terrified of what uncertainty might reveal about their actual capacity to navigate life. People who manufacture conflict are frequently unable to tolerate the silence in which they would be forced to confront what is actually happening inside them. Their external behavior is, in a precise sense, a report on their internal condition, and once you develop the ability to read that report accurately, their behavior stops feeling mysterious. It stops registering as something done specifically to you and starts appearing as something that would be happening to whoever stood in front of them. This understanding does not require sympathy for behavior that genuinely harms you. It asks for something different and more useful, the removal of the personal dimension from what is not actually personal. When something stops feeling personal, its power to wound decreases dramatically. You can observe it, assess it, and respond from clarity rather than from the shock of feeling targeted. What follows is a quality the Stoics called patience, but not the weak, passive variety that merely endures. A rigorous patience, grounded in clear, understanding of how people and patterns actually operate across time. Most things surface on their own timeline. A person operating from dishonesty cannot sustain the performance indefinitely because sustained dishonesty is expensive. Every false position demands maintenance, ongoing effort, ongoing selective memory, ongoing recontextualization. Eventually, that maintenance cost exceeds what the person can sustain, and the position begins to deteriorate publicly. Not because someone intervened at precisely the right moment, simply because unreality has a structural problem. It has to be continuously rebuilt, and eventually it cannot be. Most people find patience difficult, not because they are naturally impatient, but because they have unconsciously assigned themselves personal responsibility for forcing truth into the open on their preferred timeline. The ego wants the record corrected immediately. It wants fairness enacted in this conversation, in front of this audience, right now. And that urgency, that insistence that every misrepresentation requires an immediate and visible response, is where enormous quantities of energy simply disappear. Because in chasing that urgency, you lose things that are genuinely difficult to recover. The capacity to think without underlying anxiety contaminating the process. The ability to rest without conversations replaying. The experience of being fully present in your own life, rather than perpetually occupied managing narratives that other people construct around it. Every argument that ended externally but continues internally is a tax on everything else you are attempting to do. And unlike most taxes, this one funds nothing. It simply removes your focus and your calm and converts them into fatigue without producing anything in return. The Stoics believed this cost was genuinely avoidable, not through avoiding difficult people, which is often impossible, but through a specific interior discipline, the practice of asking, in any given moment of potential conflict, what here actually requires my genuine emotional participation, not what might feel satisfying to react to, not what my pride insists deserves a response, what functionally, practically, consequentially requires my engagement right now. Answered honestly, in most situations the answer is very little. Most provocations are invitations with no genuine obligation attached to them. There is a specific category of difficult experience that comes from watching someone speak with full confidence about something simply untrue and having to decide what to do with that observation. The corrective instinct rises almost immediately. You feel the pull towards setting the record straight before the falsehood has a chance to spread or become established. The desire to correct is not unreasonable. Some falsehoods have real consequences. But the Stoics were careful to distinguish between the instinct to correct and the wisdom to assess whether correction will actually be productive with a given person. Because truth does not always require a human defender in every instance. Truth has a longer working timeline than ego does. What is genuinely false tends toward instability because maintaining it requires sustained effort. Every false position demands ongoing work, ongoing selective recall, ongoing reframing. At some point, that maintenance cost exceeds what the person can provide, and the position begins showing its structural cracks publicly. Not because someone intervened at precisely the right moment with precisely the right words, simply because sustained inconsistency is genuinely difficult to keep structurally sound. This does not mean silence is always correct. Some situations require direct, clear, unhesitating address regardless of how the other party will receive it. Some circumstances call for unambiguous response because the stakes are too high for any other approach. But there remains a meaningful and critical difference between speaking from genuine clarity about what the situation requires and speaking from wounded pride about what you need to feel vindicated. One is guided by what actually needs to happen. The other is guided by what would make you feel better for approximately half an hour before the regret arrives. The Stoics worked constantly to distinguish between those two motivations because actions taken from each source lead to entirely different destinations. As this capacity for genuine discernment develops through practice, something changes in the quality of daily experience. Conversations that once felt dangerous begin feeling navigable, not because they have become easier, but because you bring different capabilities to them. You arrive less interested in winning them and more interested in understanding what is actually occurring beneath them. You begin asking different questions, not "How do I defeat this argument?" but "What does this person actually need?" What is the fear operating underneath this behavior? Is something genuinely important at stake here? Or is this primarily an emotional performance searching for a willing audience? Those questions, engaged honestly, tend to clarify situations faster than any counter-argument could. Gradually, and this accumulates over time rather than arriving in a single moment of sudden clarity, you stop experiencing foolish conflict as a threat and start experiencing it as data about the environment you are in. It tells you something accurate about the person you are dealing with. It tells you something about what the space you are operating in values and tolerates. It tells you, occasionally, something important about yourself, about where your ego still has more investment in being right than in being clear, about where old wounds still have enough sensitivity to pull you off balance when someone lands near them. That self-directed information, received without defensiveness and processed with honesty, is almost certainly the most valuable kind available to a person genuinely committed to growing. There is also this, the practice of emotional restraint, sustained over months and years, changes not only how you respond to difficult people, but how you relate to your own history with them. Old conversations that once carried significant emotional charge gradually lose their weight, not because you have forced yourself to forget or performed some act of deliberate forgiveness, simply because the mind that replays difficult exchanges is a mind still searching for resolution, and a mind that has learned to release the expectation of resolution from every conflict stops needing to replay them. The loop ends not through effort, but through the withdrawal of what kept it running. This creates a kind of historical lightness that is difficult to describe accurately, but immediately recognizable once experienced. The past becomes genuinely past. It stops functioning as a reservoir of unresolved grievance that quietly contaminates the present. And the present, which is the only place where your life is actually occurring, becomes accessible in a way that perpetual rumination consistently prevents. Consider what becomes possible when rumination stops occupying the space it once dominated. Creativity that was previously blocked by background tension begins moving again. Relationships that were previously colored by the emotional residue of unrelated conflicts begin experiencing the presence you actually wanted to bring to them. Projects that required sustained focus, the kind of focus that anxiety consistently interrupts, begin reaching completion. None of this happens because your external circumstances changed. It happens because the internal weather shifted. because you stopped allowing every difficult person you encountered to set the temperature of your interior experience for the hours and days that followed. The Stoics called this possession of oneself, not the absence of emotion, not the performance of detachment, but the genuine and practiced capacity to inhabit your own life rather than spending it managing the emotional consequences of other people's unresolved difficulties. That kind of self-possession is not inherited. It is built slowly through exactly the kind of choices this entire conversation has been about. The Stoics were unflinching on this dimension of the practice. Marcus Aurelius was not primarily trying to decode the behavior of the difficult people surrounding him. He was trying to understand the part of himself that could still be disturbed by them, even after years of deliberate philosophical work. Epictetus was not primarily teaching his students techniques for handling other people's irrationality. He was teaching them to see the structure of their own reactions, to recognize how quickly fear disguises itself as principled conviction, how quickly wounded pride disguises itself as righteous and legitimate indignation. What genuinely matters in any given difficult moment, not what feels satisfying right now, not what would protect my image in front of whoever is watching, but what actually serves the quality of my life, my integrity, and my thinking across the next week, month, and year. Practicing that question consistently repositions everything it touches. The argument that would have consumed an entire day begins releasing its grip within an hour. The critic whose words would have echoed for days starts losing their reach within the span of a focused morning. Not because you have numbed yourself to everything, because you have become genuinely clear about what is worth the weight of sustained attention and what is not. There is a final understanding that the Stoics arrived at which stands as something close to a summary of all the rest. Peace is not a condition that external circumstances eventually provide. It is not something that appears when the difficult people in your life finally stop being difficult, or when the world finally arranges itself in a way that no longer creates friction. Peace is a discipline. It is something that must be built, actively maintained, and deliberately defended with the same consistent effort that any other significant achievement in your life requires. The primary threat to it is not the chaos outside you that has always existed and will continue to exist. The primary threat is the repeated decision made in small unnoticed moments throughout every day to allow that external chaos to dictate the terms of your internal experience. Every unnecessary argument you choose not to enter is a small contribution to a structure that compounds over time. Every provocative comment you observe and release without absorbing is a vote for the mind you want to develop. Every time you pause before reacting, not because you are emotionless, not because nothing registers, but because you have made a considered decision about what deserves your full engagement, you are reinforcing a practice that eventually stops requiring the conscious decision and becomes the natural default. Not a performance of calm, not a strategy of detachment, a rooted, practiced, authentic steadiness that can move through difficult terrain without being consumed by it. The people around you will notice this quality before you fully feel it yourself. They will describe you as difficult to rattle, as someone who thinks clearly under pressure. What they are observing is the accumulated result of small, private decisions made again and again, not to surrender your interior life to whoever happens to be generating the most noise. And when that quality becomes genuinely yours, not performed for effect, not deployed strategically, but actually built into how you operate, the world does not simplify itself. The provocations do not stop arriving. The foolish behavior does not disappear. But your relationship to all of it transforms in a way that is difficult to fully articulate and impossible to forget once experienced. Because you are no longer living reactively, moving from one emotional stimulus to the next without genuine authorship of the direction. You are living deliberately, and the distance between those two ways of moving through a life is one of the most significant distances a person can cross. If what we explored here today opened something useful for you, if even one idea created a small shift in how you see this, I want to ask one simple thing. Press like and share this with someone who needs it right now. This is Winds of Thought, and everything created here exists for minds that are actively and seriously choosing to grow. Every person who engages with this work makes it possible to keep building it. So thank you sincerely for being part of this. The Stoics were right about most things, but perhaps the most practically valuable insight they developed is also the simplest to state and the most difficult to actually live. Foolish people have always existed, and they always will. There will always be those who seek emotional territory inside other people's reactions, who confuse volume with authority, who mistake the ability to provoke with the possession of genuine power. But the moment you withdraw the one resource they require to sustain that behavior, your disturbed attention, your visible discomfort, your reactive engagement, something that was theirs becomes permanently unavailable to them. And that quiet act of reclamation, that deliberate choice not to be moved, is among the most meaningful and lasting things any person can do for the quality of their own existence. It is worth pausing here on something that the Stoics understood with quiet precision. The person who has genuinely internalized this discipline is not harder to know, they are easier. They are easier to be around because they do not require people in their lives to manage their emotional state. They bring steadiness into shared spaces rather than volatility. They can disagree without the disagreement becoming a structural threat to the relationship. They can hear difficult things without needing the difficulty to be immediately resolved or the person delivering it to be immediately punished. These qualities, which sound simple in description and are genuinely difficult in practice, transform not only the individual who develops them but every sustained relationship that individual inhabits, because what the people closest to you most need from you is not your brilliance or your success. It is the experience of being near someone who has genuinely decided not to make their emotional instability everyone else's problem to navigate around. Real strength does not announce itself. It does not require opponents to be diminished in order to feel itself standing. It does not need the room to notice it in order to know it is present. Real strength is the mind that stays clear when everything around it is becoming clouded, steady, deliberate, fully at peace with its own sense of direction, and completely unwilling to trade that peace for the temporary satisfaction of winning an argument that never needed to be fought. There is no shortcut to this kind of equanimity, and anyone who suggests otherwise is selling something. It comes through repetition, through choosing the harder response again and again until it no longer feels hard, through deciding in small moments that your peace is worth more than the momentary relief of saying everything you feel.